Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to today's web conference. You've joined us for the Dynamics 365 FastTrack Tech Talk. Today's topic is security modeling. My name is Debbie and I will be your moderator today. We are recording on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. If you do not consent to being part of a recorded session, please disconnect your browser at this time. Attendees can access the web conference recording at the same registration site within 24 hours. We encourage you to use the messages panel today at any time to ask questions regarding content or to request support. To do so, click on the messages button at the bottom of your screen, type your question into the white box and click on send. Our presenters today will be responding to questions as we go along, and we'll do some recap at the end. We also use the messages tab to post announcements to the audience, so please take a look there now for some important information regarding today's event. Our production team strives to be a leader in delivering online content. Please help us reach this goal by providing feedback. At the end of our session, a survey URL will appear in the messages window. We ask that you please click that link, enter your email, and select the appropriate responses. Thank you for your support. With that, I appreciate your patience during our announcements. You are now going to hear a brief pause while I start today's recording. Hello and welcome to today's web conference. This is Dynamics 365 FastTrack Tech Talk. Today's topic is security modeling. Presenting with us today from Microsoft, we have Katie Havilis and Dave Block, who are both Senior FastTrack Program Managers. And now it is my pleasure to hand you over to your first speaker. Katie, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Debbie. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Security Modeling Tech Talk. A few reminders, again, before we get started. Please keep yourself muted. Any questions you have can be entered into the chat window, and we will address them as we're delivering the presentation, either via the chat or I will answer them directly on the audio. If you have any additional follow-ups after this or would like to do a deeper dive into any of the areas we covered today, please follow up directly with your assigned FastTrack engineer. And as Debbie mentioned, again, this session is being recorded. All right, in today's session, we will be covering security concepts in Dynamics 365, and this will include ownership, team management, security roles and privileges. We'll cover a bit about sharing of records in the system, as well as hierarchies and field level security. We'll have a bit of time at the end for question and answers as well. So let's get started. So Dynamics 365 has a wide variety of security modeling features, and it's important that you choose the most appropriate approach to implementing a particular solution. Each feature offers a combination of characteristics that provide a balance between granularity of access control, administrative ease for management, as well as impacts on scalability. And having an understanding of the underlying mechanisms that support each security modeling feature is useful when selecting the best approach to address your requirements. Okay. Granting access to users of the system is broken out into authentication and authorization. So authentication is determining who the user is and confirming that they are who they say they are. And then authorization is determining whether the authenticated user is entitled to access the system and what within the system they have access or are permitted to see or do. Okay. So getting into the security components within Dynamics 365, so we have security principles and access control components. Okay. Security principles are the objects to which security access can be granted. Okay, so these are the users that can have security access granted to them, right? And then we have access control components, which are the components that are used to grant the security principles access. A system user can either be a physical person or a logical entity. So, for example, providing integration with other applications might be an example of a logical entity. Okay. And system users are members of a business unit within the Dynamics 365 system. Okay. Each system user has a distinct identity for accessing Dynamics 365. Okay. We have teams. So teams cannot have an identity defined to them. So you cannot log into Dynamics 365 as a team. Okay. You log in as a user, but users can be members of teams within Dynamics 365. Okay. Teams are a logical entity used for security modeling or groupings of users within the application. A team belongs to a particular business unit within Dynamics 365. And as I mentioned before, users can be members, but teams don't necessarily have to have members. Okay. There are two types of teams within Dynamics 365. There are access teams and there are owner teams. And we will get into what each of those team types entails a little bit later in the presentation. So going into some of the access control mechanisms within Dynamics 365, we have ownership. Okay. So this defines access and privileges on records that a security principal owns. Okay. Ownership privileges are defined for the various entity types within Dynamics 365, and these are granted at a security role level. We have business unit level access. So this defines the access and privileges to records within a particular business unit to which a security principal or user or team belongs. Okay? And there are a couple of types of business unit access. There's local, which is your immediate business unit to which you're assigned. And then there's deep, or parent-child, which grants access to your immediate business unit as well as any business units that are parented by your business unit. So parent-child. Okay. There's organization access. So organization access means that you have access to all data of that particular type or entity within the organization. Okay. It can be defined at an entity type for all users or in a security role for particular users. Okay? And what that means is when you define an entity or add a new entity to the system in Dynamics 365, you have the ability to define an ownership type for the entity, and whether it's organization owned or whether it's user or team owned. If you define it as an organization owned entity, then any users that have a security role that grant access to that entity automatically have organization level access to that entity. If it's a user or team-owned entity, then the rights to the users for that entity are defined at the security role level, and you can grant them organization level access via their security role for that entity, or you can restrict it down to various levels. Sharing allows you to grant access to specific records in the system. Okay. Individual types of permission can be granted as part of sharing. So, for example, when you share a record, depending on your permissions within the system and the target user's permissions, you can grant them read access, write access, delete access, and share access with other users as well. Okay. Particular records can also allow this at the field level via the SDK as well for sharing. Access control components. So we start with privileges. Okay. Privileges are used to define a specific type of access or action that can be granted to a security principal. Okay. These are granted via a security role, and privileges are cumulative. Okay. Security roles are a collection of privileges, right? So they house a grouping of privileges to create a role that is then assigned to a user or team to define their rights and access within the system. Okay. When you're defining the privileges for a given security role, you'll have the ability, depending on the entity type or the action that you're granting rights to define whether the scope of the permission is limited to records that the user owns or the team owns, whether it's business unit level, whether it's parent-child business unit, or organization-wide access to that particular entity type. Okay. Business units, again, so these are a scoping mechanism and allow you to define logical groupings for security modeling purposes. They're hierarchical in nature. So as we mentioned before, you can have a root business unit when you deploy your organization, and then you can create child business units below that, and those business units can parent other business units and so on. Okay. And we'll cover business units in a little bit more detail later, and they don't necessarily model your organization's hierarchy. So sometimes there's a differentiation there, as our business units are more focused around a security scoping mechanism. Okay. Organization level. So again, for a particular Dynamics 365 instance, this is going to model the data for the business organization. Again, it's used as a scoping mechanism as to whether a user has the ability to view records organization-wide of a particular type, or whether it's going to be scaled down a bit. And again, that's tied to the definition of the entity when it's created within the system. A sharing role is a mechanism to define privileges to particular records in the system. So provided a user's security role grants them permissions to share records, a particular user has the ability to select records that another user might not normally have access to and share them with the user, okay, so that they can view the records or perhaps edit them as well. We also have the concept of field level security within Dynamics 365, and this allows you to restrict access to particular fields for a given entity. Okay. And the access to those fields can be granted to users or teams within the system. And then we also have the concept of hierarchies. Okay. So you can define hierarchical structures that can be based on either managers or positions within the system. Okay. Hierarchies allow users to inherit permissions based on the hierarchy to which they're a member of. Managers can inherit record access to records that are owned by their subordinates. And we'll get into each of these in a little more detail as we go through the presentation. So in today's overview, we will go through all of the components that comprise the security model within Dynamics 365. Okay. We'll talk through how to combine the different elements in order to deliver on your requirements. Okay. And again, as we mentioned earlier, it's important to consider all of the available mechanisms for access control within Dynamics 365 to make sure you're balancing granularity of access, scalability, and also the overall simplicity of being able to manage the security model within the application on an ongoing basis. Okay, so let's get into ownership. Okay. So within Dynamics 365, records can be user-owned, team-owned or organization-owned. When you add an entity to Dynamics 365, you define the ownership type for the entity, and your options are user or team-owned, which is one option, or organization-owned. User or team-owned ownership type allows you to scope the level of access that a given security role will have to records of that type. Okay? So I have the ability to say a given security role for an entity that is user or team-owned can only see the records of that type that are assigned to them or that they own. Right? Or I can say that that security role grants access to records of that type for business unit level. So that would cover any records that the user owns or any records that are owned by another user or team that is a member of that user's same business unit. You can also set that at the parent-child level or the organization level for a given security role. For organization type ownership of a record, you can only grant access to the record type. I can't grant access to specific levels. I can't scope it. So if a given entity is organization owned, if you grant a security role access to that entity, then it's going to be organization-wide access. So they would be able to see all records that are of that entity type, regardless of their business unit, right? And there's no ownership defined on them. So you can't assign those records to a particular user. Okay? So you want to be mindful when you're creating an entity of the purpose of the entity in the system. There are valid reasons for having organization-owned records. Sometimes they're when you're using an entity as a list of values, right? Or an option set type entity. You want to be, you don't necessarily need to have a user or owner for those records, and you want to grant access and everybody can see everything within that entity, right? So there's valid reasons, but you want to be sure of the purpose of the entity, and that setting it as an organization-owned entity makes sense, right? If you're ever in doubt or not sure of the appropriate ownership type, or you think it might change and at some point you might need to restrict access, maybe if we use that list of values example, maybe different departments might have different values that are relevant for them and you want to be able to filter those out. It's safer to go with user or team because it grants you more flexibility than an organization-owned entity would. So if you're in doubt, go with user or team. Okay? You can't change the type once you create the entity. Okay? So user ownership provides the granularity necessary to grant access to specific records by using security roles to define privileges that ensure that a user sees only the records that are owned by that user. For businesses in which individuals work independently on specific deals or on customer collaborations, this is an effective and efficient model. For scenarios where multiple people need to interact with specific records, this might not necessarily be the most viable solution. Okay. A record's business unit is derived from the owner of the record. Okay. So each user must belong to a business unit in the system. Okay. By default, when users are synchronized to your Dynamics 365 instances, they'll default as being a member of your root or organization business unit, and then you can modify the business unit to which the user belongs on a user-by-user basis. Okay. With user ownership, access is implicit in the record ownership itself. So there's no need to maintain a secondary table to determine access grants when you're using the user ownership model. Okay? This is important because it reduces overall volumes of data in the system, and it allows you to have nice scalability within the system. Okay? As we go into some of the other models for access control, you'll see where these secondary tables come into play, and some tips and tricks and rules to be mindful of. Team ownership allows users to be granted access to data across business units or within a specific business unit. Okay? So if we have user A and user B, and they're both members of the same team, so let's say they're members of Team A, and Team A owns the record, okay, those users would have the access granted to the team to that particular record. It leverages the benefit of direct access definition, okay? It allows for multiple users to be granted access through ownership. Okay? So if I had user A in business unit B, if I had user B in business unit B, but they are both members of Team A, even if their security role is limited in scope of access to that particular record, the team that owns the record that they're both members of grants them access to the record via that team. And as we mentioned earlier, there are two types of teams in Dynamics 365, which offer different scalability and administration implications, and they're relevant for different scenarios. Okay? So owner teams, as the name implies, can own records in the system. Okay? They can be manually created. They can be programmatically created and managed through the SDK and customization to the application. Okay? They can't be used as a resource in scheduling. Okay? Access teams cannot own records. They cannot be granted security roles directly. Okay? They're hidden from most of the team views. Okay? They can, however, be system managed or automatically managed, okay, directly from the records form in the application. Okay? So when should you use an owner team versus an access team? Okay, so again, owner teams require manual management of them in the application. So somebody needs to create the team, needs to add members to the team, and remove members to the team. That, or again, you can, leveraging the SDK, you can customize the application to handle it programmatically, right? But it's not out of the box to automate the management of a given team, okay? Owner teams can own records. They can grant users access to records across various business units that their directly assigned security role might not normally grant them access to. Okay. Access teams are dynamically formed and dissolved. Okay. So they're generally used for scenarios where it's specific use case or set of circumstances where a user needs to have access to a particular record, but they don't normally require access to all of the records of that particular type. Okay? So for example, let's say you have a scenario where you are leveraging case management in Dynamics 365, and on a specific basis for a certain case, you might need to involve a particular investigator. And they don't need to work on all the cases in the system. It's specific cases where you need to pull them in, and they only need access maybe for a specific period of time to contribute to the case. Okay. Leveraging access teams, you can grant that user access to the case, and that case will automatically be shared with that user. Okay? And the team, the access team itself, is not created until the first user is added as a member for that particular record. So when I add the investigator to the access team, if that's the first member of the team, at that point the team is created. The record is then shared and access granted to that user. Okay. Once the last user is removed from the team, the system will automatically remove the team from the system. Okay, so it helps keep the tables under control, and that automated management is nice. It removes the sharing for you, it removes the team for you, right? And it fits specific use cases. Okay. Access teams are good for large numbers of team memberships per user, okay? Or if you have rapidly changing teams. Okay? It's also good when the owner of the record is able to define access for others in the system. So if we use our case management example, the owner of the case is the one that has the ability to define the access team members that should also have access to that case. Okay. It's also good to support when different groups need to have different permissions to that record. So you can create a sort of template for access teams, and you can add the appropriate user to the right template on the record. So you might have a user that should only have read access to the record, and then you might have another user group that needs to have both read and write access, right? Again, specific scenarios where they need access to particular records of that type. So you could have two different access team templates and add the appropriate users to the right team to grant them access to that record for the time that they need access. Okay. Owner teams, again, these are good when you have access to particular records that might be scoped by business area. Again, they allow access across business units, okay, and they have specific security roles assigned to the team that then grant access to all the members. Also good for scenarios where the team might have access to millions of records in the system, so it's a scalable model. Owner teams are also good when you have a clear definition for the number of teams and the members of the team, so they're known when you're designing the system. There is, again, a bit of overhead. Someone needs to add the teams to the system and needs to be able to manage the users that are associated to those teams when you're using owner teams. So let's talk a little bit about the scalability characteristics of teams within Dynamics 365. Okay. All right, so independence from the data. So the performance of the security model is independent of the amount of end data that the teams are owners of, right? So no matter how many records that the team might own, there's an independence there. It's not going to have an impact, okay, on the performance and amount of data, which is a significant difference from the sharing model that we're going to cover in a little bit here, okay? There's also independence from the team volumes. Okay, so the number of teams in the system doesn't directly impact the performance, right? So testing up to 100,000 teams did not have a significant impact on performance. Okay. Increase in team membership is linear in impact in the response times, okay, when you're looking at the capacity of the system. Large team memberships do have an increase in the cache load impact. Okay, so with lots of user and team membership, this can have a bit of an impact on initial load. Okay, but it can be warmed up in order to mitigate this. Users being members of up to 1,000 different teams has been feasible in testing. Okay, if you're looking at a significantly higher number than that, then we should review what the requirements are and put some consideration to the potential usage in combination with other features and control mechanisms in order to limit the number of teams when we're getting into those types of numbers. So overall implications of ownership within Dynamics 365. Okay. So we need to check the user and any of their owner teams with permissions against that particular owner team and the owner ID of the particular record in the system. Okay, so with that said, the more teams to which a user is a member, the more checks that are needed. Okay. Again, the number of teams in the system in and of itself is not a factor in the overall performance. Okay. It works well when we have individual groups of a record, right, or have unique or uncommon access defined, where we have users that might directly own the record, teams that might directly own the record, and then we also have that, again, ability to define access teams to grant specific record access in those edge scenarios. Okay. Now, when there's large groups of common access defined, a business unit might be more appropriate. So when we can wall off access to a large data set to a large group of users, we can start looking at business units as a scoping mechanism for defining and breaking up record access in the system. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about business units. Okay. So business units are the foundation of organization structure. However, they don't necessarily need to replicate your particular organization structure. Okay. When we talk about business units, they are a scoping and security mechanism within Dynamics 365, and that's how they should be used. Right? So you don't necessarily need to set up a hierarchy that mimics your organization's hierarchy just to have it replicated within Dynamics 365. The business unit should be set up in order to restrict access to records within the application. Okay. It defines a logical separation within an organization. So maybe it's geographies that you want to separate or restrict data access to. Right? Or maybe it's specific departments, okay? So they're a mechanism for controlling access within Dynamics 365. Users belong to a specific business unit, and security roles can also be business unit specific. Okay? So on the right side there, we have an example business unit hierarchy structure within Dynamics, right? So in this example, we have a root business unit, APAC, and then within APAC, we've divided this up to Australia and New Zealand, right, and Singapore, and then within ANZ, we've got the breakdown for Australia and then New Zealand as child business units, right? So we have 3 levels of business units within this example hierarchy. So if we set up this hierarchy within Dynamics 365, for those entities that are user or team owned, right, we have the ability to define the scoping access to business unit level, again, or parent-child business unit, organization, or user-owned. Okay. We'll go through an example of this in a little more detail on the next slide. Okay. From a security role perspective, where we said they could be business unit specific, so security roles are inherited by business units from their parent business unit. So any security roles that are defined at the top level are going to trickle down to the child business units. They have to be modified within the business unit in which they were created, right? I could also create security roles that are specific to just one of these child business units. So maybe I have a security role that's specific to Australia, and I don't really want it to be available or show up in the ANZ business unit or Singapore or APAC. I can create that security role directly within the Australia business unit, and that's the only place it would show up in this particular example. Okay. Another example of a business unit hierarchy. So we have our root as Contoso, and then we've got two child business units where we've separated it out by department, for example. So we've got sales and we've got service. And then within sales, we've got two other child business units that are more separated by geography, where we have North America and EMEA. Okay. This would allow us to define, again, access, where we could say, you know, maybe sales has access to accounts and contacts and opportunities within their business unit. Service has a different access rights within their business unit. Okay. But we also have the ability to grant it organization-wide, right, where anyone in any of the business units would be able to see a particular entity and records for that entity. All right, skipped ahead a slide there. Okay, so here's another example of a business unit hierarchy. Okay, so here we have corporate, which is our root business unit, okay, our organization base. And then within there, we have EMEA and Asia. Okay, within EMEA, we've got Poland, Czech, and then we've got branches below that. Okay. So if we look here, we've got one user, right, who's a member of the Poland business unit. Okay? And we've got another user that's a member of the Poland business unit. Okay? This user, who is the owner of the record in the system, has ownership or has access to that particular record because they are the owner of the record. Our other user, down in the bottom left corner, has derived access because the security role for that user is saying that they have business unit level access to that record type. And so while they're not the owner of the record, they're a member of the owner's business unit. So they are then granted access to the record based on their security role, saying they have business unit level access to that type of record in the system. Okay. That record is part of the Poland business unit because the owner of the record is a member of the Poland business unit. Now, if we had another user that was a member of the EMEA business unit, and that user's security role granted them access, parent-child access to that record type, they would then derive access because they are a member of the parent business unit of Poland. Now, another scenario which ties together the team concept in the system. So let's say we have our member of the Poland business unit, and then we have another user who is a member of our Czech business unit, okay? And they own the record in the system, okay? The team has our member from Poland and our member from Czech, right? So since our member from Poland is a member of the team that is assigned to the Czech business unit, okay, this user in our Poland business unit is going to derive access to the record via the team they're a member of. Okay, so that one's a little bit confusing, so I'm going to walk through it one more time. Okay, so we have our user A, who's a member of the Poland business unit. We have our user B, who's a member of the Czech business unit. Okay. We have a team that is owned by the Czech business unit. So this team was created within the Czech business unit. Okay. And our Poland user is going to derive access to the record that's owned by the user from the Czech business unit because they are a member of a team that is owned by the Czech business unit. Okay, so they get access to that via their team because the team has business unit level access to that record type within the system. Okay, so this is an example of how users that normally wouldn't have access to that particular record, so they might have access to that record type, right, within their business unit, but since they're in a different business unit, they normally wouldn't have access to that specific record because it's part of a different business unit. But the team is allowing them to cross boundaries and have access to that record. Okay. So again, business units allow for managing access to large groups of records where we can define the group and the permissions. Let's talk about some implications of business unit access. So it's designed for slowly changing structures and larger group access. Okay. So if you have a group that's constantly changing, okay, back and forth, so maybe they're jumping between what you were thinking of setting up as business units, there's some management and some implications to having to move users across business units. So if it's a rapidly changing structure, business units is probably not the best mechanism for security control. Okay. Okay, so examples that might fit into business units, so call center or branches, different divisions, okay, or compliance and structures for reporting and governance. Okay. High volumes of business units or rapidly changing business units, those can have impacts and are not intended for very high volumes, okay? Access is pre-calculated, so high volumes or frequent changes can have an impact on the system and performance. Okay. With business units, similar to our ownership model, records are immediately available to all users within the business unit. There's no additional calculations or processing that needs to be performed in order to determine the access grants. And again, we see linear growth in access as data volumes grow. And it looks like we have a question, so I'm going to go back to the prior slide and look at the question that we have. So within the current diagram, can we build teams within the Poland business unit? Each team has different systems that they are using. Will EMEA be able to see all of the records within the teams that are part of Poland? Okay, so yes, you could add a team under any of these business units. So we could add a team under Poland. We can add a team under EMEA, under corporate, under Asia. Okay. What the members of the team are going to be able to see is going to depend on the security role that is granted to the team. Okay, so if you granted the team a security role that says they have user level access to contacts in the system, the users that are members of that team are only going to be granted access via the team to contacts that are owned by the team. Okay, if you said that the team has business unit level access to contacts and that team is a member of, is owned by the Poland business unit, then that's going to grant access to any contacts that are owned by that team or by users within the Poland business unit. Okay. So it's not going to necessarily grant EMEA any access. If there was a user that was a member of the EMEA business unit, but they were a member of the team that was created within the Poland business unit, then it would grant that EMEA user access to the records that are owned by the users in the Poland business unit if that was what the security role granted, right? If we said it was business unit level access. Okay. And if we skipped up a level to corp, again, it all depends on the security role. And so if the security role, let's say, said parent-child access and the user was a member of corp and the team was a member of Poland, then that's going to grant access to the team's business unit, which is Poland, and any business units below it. If you have more detail on that question, feel free to add more questions onto that and we'll revisit. Okay, so let's talk about security roles in the system, one of our major components here. Okay, so security roles are managed through the system settings. Okay, so if you navigate to Settings, System, Security, that will take you to the landing page that gives you access to see the users in the system. You can create security roles. You can assign the security roles to users. It's also where you can set up business units, teams, your hierarchy security, as well as access team templates and field security profiles. Okay. So when we look at a security role within Dynamics 365, it's going to consist of a collection of privileges. Okay, they're going to be record level privileges and task-based privileges. Okay. When we look at the privileges, the record level privileges that can be granted, okay, we have along the left side here, we've got the list of our various privileges. So we've got create permission. Okay, so create permission is required to add a new record to the system. Okay, so if a user does not have create permission to a particular record or entity type, then they would not be able to add a new record of that type to the system. Okay. Read access is required to be able to open a record, view the contents of a record, or the contents of a record, I'm sorry. It's also required in order to be able to have a record assigned to you. Okay, so if I don't have permission to a particular entity type, then I can't have that entity record, a record for that entity assigned to me. Okay. Write access is required to edit or make changes to records of that type. Okay. Delete is another privilege that can be granted to records or entity types within a security role. Okay, so that's required to permanently remove a record from the system. Okay. Append, which is required to associate a record with the current record. Okay, so let's say if a user has append rights on a case within the system, the user would then be able to associate another record to case. So they can associate a note to the case. Okay. Append to is required to associate the current record with another record in the system. Okay. So for example, a note can be attached to a case if the user has append to rights on the note. Okay. So append and append to go hand in hand, right? So I need append on the case to be able to attach a note, and I need append to on the note to be able to attach it to the case. Okay. Assign is a required privilege in order to grant ownership to another user. So if I want to assign a record to another user in the system, I need to have assign privileges to that record, and the user needs appropriate permissions in order for me to be able to assign it to them. So I need to be able to have permission to do assignments, and the user receiving it needs to have the appropriate permission for them to be able to receive the assignment. Okay. Share is another privilege that can be granted for record types within a security role. Okay, so sharing allows you to give a user access to a record. You still maintain your ownership of the record, but you can't, if you own it, right? Maybe you don't own it and you just have the permission to share a record within your business unit or organization. But it maintains the current user as the owner, but allows you to grant permission to the record to a user that wouldn't normally have access to it. So those are the privileges we can grant, and then there's specific access or scoping levels that are tied to those privileges. Okay, so when I grant read access to a record, okay, provided it's a user or team type ownership of a record, I have the ability to define the access level for that read. Okay, so the first access level we have is global or organization level access. And when you're looking at a security role, this is the filled in green circle. Okay, so this grants access organization-wide to that particular record type. So if I grant organization read to a security role for contacts, that means that any user assigned that security role would be able to see all contacts in the organization, regardless of who owns them, what business unit they belong to. They've been granted organization level read so they can see all of them within the system. Okay. Likewise with write or delete or append to, right? If I grant organization level access to that, it's going to let me perform that action or privilege across the organization for that record type. So if I say the customer service security role has organization level delete rights to contacts, then someone with that security role would be able to delete any contact in the system. We then have deep, which is also known as the parent-child business unit scoping or access level. Okay, so when this is defined for a particular privilege, it gives the user or that is granted that security role permission to perform that privilege within their business unit and any business units that are parented by their business unit. Okay. So if we go back to the hierarchy we had previously, if we had EMEA and a user within the EMEA business unit that was granted parent-child or deep permission to delete accounts or contacts in the system, they would be able to delete contacts within their EMEA business unit or any of the business units below that. Local is also known as business unit level access. Okay, so this grants the security role or the user that's assigned to the security role permission within their specific business unit. So if I had read access to contacts and it was defined as business unit level access to read, then I would be able to see any contacts that were owned by me or another user or team within my business unit. I wouldn't be able to see the child business unit or my parent business unit, only those within my direct business unit. Finally, we have basic level. Well, not finally, we have one more after that, but basic is also known as user. Okay, so this grants the user access to a record that the user owns or that's assigned to them. Okay, so if I had user level read access to contacts, I would only be able to see contacts in the system that are assigned to me, that I'm the owner of. Okay, I wouldn't be able to see anything else in my business unit unless I was a member of a team that was granted access, right? So, so if a user's a member of a team that is granted a security role, that can increase the records that they have access to see in the system, right? And then finally, we have none, right? So if you do not have one of the previous access levels defined, then you do not have access to that particular privilege, okay? So if my read access to contact was set to none, I wouldn't be able to see contacts in the system. Okay, so now we'll move on to the sharing model within Dynamics 365. So sharing is the act of directly granting privileges for a particular record to users or teams that need to have access to it, but their roles don't grant them access to the record. Okay. The grant can specify the type of access and action. So we can say they're allowed to read the record or update it or delete it or share it with others. Okay. So you can grant the user, again, you can give them read access, you can give them write access, assign access, append, share access, okay, or delete access. Okay. You can't grant them access that their security role restricts them from performing. Okay. So if the user's security role does not allow them to delete contacts in the system, for example, okay, so if the user doesn't have at a minimum a user level delete to contact via their security role, I can't give them access to delete via sharing the record with them. Okay, so they need at a minimum user level delete access in order for me to grant them delete permission via sharing. If their security roles say they have no access to delete contacts in the system, I can't say, well, yes, you do via me sharing this record. They at least need a minimum of the user level there, okay? Likewise with any of the other permissions. So if the user security role doesn't give them any access to contacts, so maybe they don't even have read access to contacts, I can't then share the record with them and give them access to contacts just via share. They need that user level minimum access in order for the share to properly grant access to the records. Sharing leverages our principal object access table. So this is the table that records all of the sharing rules between your security principals and the individual entity instances. Okay, so each record within the principal object access table, which is also referred to as POA, so you'll see that probably within this presentation, or you might hear different people within Microsoft and Dynamics talking about the POA table. So within the POA table, each record links a particular system user or team to the entity record that it's been granted sharing privileges to. Okay, so the record also stores the level of privilege that's been granted, which is what specifies the ability for the user to read, write, assign, share, right? And it also includes information about the records that are shared via cascading relationships as well. And this is an important aspect to be mindful of, because the cascade can have a very big impact on the number of records that are in your POA table. Okay. So sharing's often used to grant explicit access to records. Okay. It should be used as an exception-based model. So sharing should not be your primary method of granting access to records in Dynamics. Okay. Okay. The approach works well for smaller volumes of data or in smaller implementations, okay, where it's used again on an exception-based. Okay. In larger implementations, okay, where we can handle things through a general policy and a larger scoping mechanism, we would use something like the business units, the teams, etc., and just leverage sharing as an exception-based. Okay. As the number of records in the database grows, or the number of shares grows, your POA table starts growing, right? And a very large principal object access table can have performance implications, okay? So if we look at the example here on this diagram, okay, we have user A and user B who have shared record X, right? So What's might not be obvious when a record is being shared with another user is that cascade that happens, okay? So if that record has a relationship with other records or child records in the system, there's relationship behaviors that define what happens when a record is shared. And for parental relationships, that sharing behavior is set to cascade the share. So let's say we have a record that has many child records via a parental relationship. Not only is the record that you're directly sharing shared, but also all of those child records that are related to the record. Okay? So it might not be one record that's shared, it might be 50 records that are shared with that user. Okay? So sharing with teams as opposed to individual users can cut down on that POA table a bit, okay? So if we can define a group of users that we need to share the records with, instead of sharing with, 10 individual users, if we can define them as a team, we can share with the team and share it with 1 instead of 10. And then they derive access via their team membership. Okay, so that can cut down on the POA table and record set within the POA table dramatically as well. Again, you still have to consider the implications of the team management and make sure that that fits into your requirements and your ongoing maintenance and scalability. But it can help where you can define those members of the team clearly and then share the records with team members. Again, if we're looking at very high record volumes, then, the POA table growth can become problematic. So this defines our sharing data model. Okay, so these are the various tables within the Dynamics 365 database. Okay, so we have our user principals. So those are organizations, business units, teams, system users. Okay. So we have the record for the user. We have a record linking to the user to each team that they're a member of, right? That's tying to our system user principal here. So we have that tied to our system user, our organization, our business unit, our teams. Right? And then we're tied to the principal object access table, right? So this is the table that's holding all the permissions to the records. Okay, so that's got our shared records, it's got our organization-owned records, it's got user records like settings and activity records. So those are records to which the user principals an activity party on. Okay, so as we've been talking about, when records are shared with a large number of users and teams, this can cause your POA table to grow dramatically, okay? And this is significantly impacting by that cascade. Okay. I know this is a bit of an eye chart. Your FastTrack engineer can also provide you with a PDF version of this presentation. Okay, it'll be a little bit easier to zoom in here. But it goes through an overview of the underlying data. So we have our system user, which is joined to our system user principal table, which is joined to our principal object access table, right? These are all the various checks that are going to be performed when determining the record set that the user has access to within Dynamics 365. So reviewing some of the implications of sharing. So again, if I haven't said it enough, it works well as how it's intended as an exception-based mechanism for granting record access. Okay. It can result in large volumes of data, okay, and higher processing demands with having to check all of these rules in the POA table can have performance and scalability implications, okay? Again, there's an administrative overhead to sharing. Okay, so one of the things that I don't think we've covered in detail during the sharing portion of the presentation yet is revoking sharing. So when you're looking at an explicit share of a record, so I go into the system and I share an account with one of my coworkers. That account is going to remain shared with that coworker until I go in and revoke access to it. So it doesn't automatically unshare the record at any point in time. That share will persist until I revoke it. Okay? Slightly different than what we talked about with access teams. So access teams have that ability that the system manages the creation of the team. When you add a user to the team, the share is granted. When you remove a user from the team, the share is revoked. And when the last user is removed, it cleans it up and removes the team from the system. So there's still the action of someone needing to add the user to the team and remove them, but the system takes care of cleaning up the share when you were talking about access teams, as long as you're performing the removal of the user from the access team. Okay. With direct sharing, the system allows that sharing to persist until you say this user or team should no longer have access to the record and you revoke the sharing. Okay. Security hierarchies. Okay, so this is another mechanism for deriving or inheriting permissions to records within Dynamics. Okay. So security hierarchies allow for privileges to be automatically granted to managers of users within the application. Okay. And you can grant the number of levels that the manager should have access to. Okay. So when we're using the manager hierarchy, by default, the direct manager of a user would have read and edit permissions to records via the hierarchy. Okay. Whereas the second level or skip level manager would automatically be granted read access to any of the records owned by their direct subordinates. Okay. There's no need for you to customize to automate this. You can set up your hierarchy and the system will automatically derive the access based on the management hierarchy here. Okay. So you can see here where we have salespeople down here. Okay. The manager of the salesperson role would automatically inherit read and write access to the records owned by the salesperson. The director up here, which is managing the manager, right? They would be granted read level access to the salesperson records. Okay. The CEO, who is the manager of the director, isn't granted access to these records, right? And likewise, the director would have read-write access to any records that were directly owned by the manager. Okay. All right, so the manager hierarchy leverages the system user recursive manager hierarchy. So if you look at the manager on the user record, there's a field in there for you to be able to specify manager for a given user, and the hierarchy takes advantage of that. Okay. So this might be a standard configuration that you already have defined within your organization. We also have a position-based hierarchy. So it's similar to the manager hierarchy, but more than one person can be linked to each level. Okay, so if you have multiple managers that might be supporting a pool of resources or like a call center environment, right? This is a good model for that, right? Leveraging the position hierarchy versus the manager hierarchy, because a user can only have a single manager. Okay, but if the position base, we can allow for more than one person level. Okay. when we look at the position-based hierarchy, okay, there's only a single position hierarchy at this point, right? So I can't hold multiple positions. Okay, but a similar model. So if we look on the right side here, we can see we have VP of sales. We then have a pool of sales managers or service managers, which can be multiple people. And then we have support reps or sales reps below that in this example. And that's going to grant their access to the records. So the service managers would have read-write access to those records owned by support. VP of service would inherit read access to those records. Okay. Security hierarchies are enabled, again, through the settings security section that we looked at earlier when we were looking at where security roles are managed. You can enable the security hierarchies, and then you can choose whether you're doing position-based or manager-based hierarchy and continue with the configuration of your hierarchy for that security management. Okay. Now, there are some considerations with leveraging the hierarchies. You should try to keep your levels to 4 or fewer for access level, okay? And it works best when you're looking at limiting the number of direct reports to around 50, okay? The maximum recommended is 100, and there's some implications to this, similar to the sharing model with cascading that we were looking at, where there can be a significant number of records that are granted access in addition to the records that you think you might be granting access to, right? There's cascade impacts, right? Especially with the number of subordinates and direct reports that are being considered as part of this model, okay? So a senior management level, in this example, might end up with access to millions of records via their direct reports and then the subordinates below their direct reports and their skip levels. Okay. So in this example, whoops, right? You can see here we have, right, 3 levels. The manager might still end up with thousands of reports below them and millions of records, right? So if we had done 10 levels, you can imagine how much this can grow, right? So if we look at here, this example, we have a salesperson that might have 100 accounts with 49 activities on each account, okay? So we're looking at, 5,000 records. Each manager has 10 reports, and we're looking at 50,000 records for the managers. Each director might have 10 reports. You're looking at 500,000. So this grows, whereas the top level is looking at potentially 5 million records, right? So similar to our direct sharing model, you need to be mindful of the numbers that you're looking at when you're configuring these security hierarchies. All right, so field level security. And we're getting to our last topic of the day. So if you have questions, you can feel free to start adding them to the chat if you haven't already. So field level security allows you to restrict access to specific fields within the system. Typically, these are high impact, high business impact fields, okay? And you want to restrict access to specific users or teams within the system, okay? Similar to record-based security, this applies after the other privileges have taken effect, okay? So for example, if a user has read permission to account, okay, that's going to grant them access to accounts, right? Then the security profile, the field level security profile, will be applied on top of it to determine if there's fields that they are restricted from seeing or that they have access to see on the account level, right? So if they have no access to the account entity in the system, field level security to accounts for them is irrelevant, right? Because they don't have access to the entity anyway. Okay. Field level security leverages profiles to determine whether a particular user or team has access to a secured field. Okay. So a field level security profile, this is separate from a security role. So you define a field security profile and you grant the access that that profile is going to give to the fields that have been defined as secured fields. Okay, so you can define whether that profile is granting read access to the field, create, so they can define it when the record's created, and whether they have the ability to update that field after it's been created. Okay. And a profile can define access to any number of fields that you've flagged as field level security or as being secured fields, right? So I can create a profile and I can select all of the fields that have been secured and what level of access, if any, this profile is going to grant to those fields. Okay. Something to be mindful of is when you turn field level security on for a field, so when you're in the customization section of Dynamics for an entity and you add a new field or you open an existing field, there's a flag for whether you want to enable field level security for that field. If you enable field level security for that field and publish that change out, by default, your users will not have access to that field. They must be granted a field level security profile that gives them permission to that field in order for them to have access to it. Okay, so it's restricted as soon as you enable it and publish that change out, and then the user is granted a profile that will say they have read access to the field, or they have create and read access to the field, or they can enter it on create, they can read it, and they can update it after. Okay? And those security profiles can be granted or assigned to a user or a team. A team or a user can be assigned multiple field level security profiles. Okay? And then all of these things, the security role, the field level security profile, sharing, all of this combination is going to determine which records and fields that user has access to when they access the application. So again, the diagram that we were looking at earlier, right? So you need to consider all of the topics that we've covered today, all of the access control mechanisms that we have available to come up with the best approach based on, the number of users, the number of records, the requirements of your application. Okay? So leveraging all of the components we've covered today, ownership, team membership, the various security roles that you can define in the system, okay, sharing of records, field level or security hierarchies, as well as field level security to create the best approach for your security model in Dynamics 365. Okay. And with that, we have some time for any questions you might have on security. All right, well, if there's no questions, we can wrap up today. Thank you again for attending. And this will also be posted to our Infopedia site for on-demand viewing after today, along with the other sessions that have been presented and pre-recorded. And again, if you have any questions on security model, want to review best practices or approaches for your particular implementations, please reach out to your assigned FastTrack engineer, and they can also provide you a copy of today's presentation as well.
Hi there, Katie. So no questions?
Doesn't look like it.
All right. So, folks, I would like to call your attention to the survey link. Actually, there's another one here. Did you guys address the one that I have in the IM window?
I didn't. I'm sorry.
That's okay. If you scroll
Let's
up a little
see.
bit, you'll see.
Oh, okay. I didn't see.
There's a couple of them. No worries.
I addressed the earlier one. Okay, so there's one more. It looks like just came in. Our department is building a lot of custom entities, but they are designed for different user groups. Does this mean we would need to build different security roles for them? Or can we build a new role and use business unit or team? Can we assign rights to these custom entities? Yes, so you can. So it kind of depends on what type of access you want to grant. So a security role, you can leverage out-of-the-box security roles that we provide. You can also create copies of those out-of-the-box security roles to create your own custom security roles. And that's generally the method we recommend when you're creating your own custom. Start with the out-of-the-box one that's most closely aligned, and then add or remove permissions from it. So within a given security role, you'll see a tab for custom entities, and that's where any entities that you add to the system will show up, and you can define for that particular security role the permission that the user will have to, or that the users assigned to that role will have to those custom entities. Okay. And if you have users that should have different types of access to those entities, then yes, you would want to define different security roles that grant the appropriate permission. So for example, if you have custom entity A, and there's one group of users that should only have read access to that entity, you should have a security role that grants that permission to the entity. And if you have another group that should have read and write access, or read, write, create, and delete access, you would want to have a security role that grants that appropriate permission and assign those to the user or teams that should have those. If a user's security role does not grant them any access to the custom entities you've added, they won't see them as available within the application. Okay, so when you add a new entity to Dynamics, the only, your security roles won't automatically inherit any sort of access to it. The system administrator and system customizer security roles will, but we don't automatically grant any sort of access to the rest of the security roles within the application. You have to go in and select the roles that should have access and define their appropriate permission levels.
Great. Thanks, Katie. So anyone else for questions there? While we're waiting for those, folks, I would like to call your attention to the survey link that I posted in the messages window. Your feedback is very valuable to us. Please take a moment to fill it out prior to logging out. Click your email, or click the link, enter your email. You'll be taken into the survey. Our voting scale is on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the best score possible. Be sure to click on the submit button at the bottom to ensure that your feedback has been received. And with that, Katie, I don't see any additional comments, so do you have any closing remarks before we conclude today's recording?
Nope, just what I said earlier, so please feel free to follow up with your FastTrack engineer if you have any additional questions or would like to review use cases or scenarios, or a copy of the presentation today.
Great. All right. Thanks, Katie. So, ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude today's web conference. The recording will be available at the same registration site within 24 hours. Again, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Katie, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.